We are about to discuss comparative advantages and disadvantages of markets and governments as mechanisms of resource allocation. As we've just noted, markets are based on private decision-making and private ownership. Governments are public agencies, and they move resources about economies by commands, by orders, by fiat. So to what extent markets are superior or inferior to governments in this capacity as mechanisms of resource allocation? To answer this question, of course, we have to be guided by efficiency. Remember, economics is a science about wealth of nations, and wealth of nations depends on how efficiently they put in use the available resources. Before we do these comparisons, it's important for us to agree how we will be measuring efficiency of resource allocation. This is a very serious and controversial question. If we measure resource allocation from the perspective of a single individual, this is a fairly simple task. After all, we believe that individuals are rational, and that often means that they know what they want, what they like, and what they don't like. Put slightly differently and a bit more technically, individuals have preferences. And it's common for economists to describe such preferences by utility functions, which assigns a number, a value, to every option available to the individual. And the greater is this value, the more preferable a particular option is. And therefore, individual choice can be therefore described, if you will, modeled as the maximization of a utility function. So far, so good. But societies are populated not by one individual, but by many, by actually very many. And then the question is, of course, that would be an appropriate slide here. And then the question is, of course, how you measure efficiency in the presence of many decision makers, in the presence of many agents that perhaps have different views of what is good, what is not, what is efficient, and what is not, and so forth. A general and powerful answer to this question was given by a renowned economist and sociologist by the name of Alfredo Pareto. Pareto introduced the concept of what is now known as Pareto dominance and Pareto optimality. Suppose you have two options and several individuals which compare these options. If some individuals think that option A is better than option B, and none believes that option B is better than option A, then we would say that option B is Pareto preferred to option B, because it's preferred by some people and none opposes that, so other people are perhaps indifferent between these two options. Quite obviously, if all people agree that A is better than B, then of course it's even more, so to say, Pareto superior to option B. And therefore, an efficient outcome, an efficient version of resource allocation would be the one which is Pareto optimal. Pareto optimal is an option or a resource allocation such that there is no other way to reallocate resources that would entail in an allocation that would be Pareto superior, Pareto preferable to the given one. So to conclude, we would say that resource allocation is optimal, not just from an individual point of view, but from the social point of view, if it is Pareto optimal. And now very big, very important question. Suppose you have a market economy, suppose this is an uncontrolled, unregulated market economy, completely freewheeling, what they call laissez-faire market economy. And in this economy, you have a community of individuals, and every individual makes individual choices, and these choices are optimal for this individual. But no one is concerned, and for that matter, in charge for social optimality. Can we expect that such combination of individual choices will be socially optimal, will be Pareto optimal? And against all the odds, the answer in some circumstances is yes. And this answer is given by the famous first theorem of welfare economics. This is a more rigorous formulation, essentially, of the metaphor of the invisible hand, introduced first by Adam Smith, who was amazed by reflecting upon what by reflecting upon what many people took for granted, that is that market forces are able to maintain harmony in societies and economies when no one is in charge in allocating resources across the economy, across society. All decisions are individual, all decisions are private. All decisions are seemingly uncorrelated and, all decisions are uncoordinated with each other. And nonetheless, you have an outcome which is not just an equilibrium, but apparently a very efficient equilibrium, which entails the best possible use of the resources available to the society. And this is precisely what the first theorem of welfare economics says. It's all about. It states that market equilibria are Pareto efficient. Market equilibria, which are outcomes of individual self-seeking behavior, in fact entail efficient allocation of resources in the economy, in society. However, this great result is contingent on some requirements, on some conditions. It's not true universally. And perhaps the most essential of these conditions is that all transactions in an economy, for the first theorem to hold, have to be supported by competitive markets. In other words, whatever people do in this economy should involve competitive markets. And for every commodity, for every transaction, for every interaction, there should be a competitive market at hand. And of course, we all know that this is not the case in our life. So this is an exaggeration. In real life, markets are either not competitive or, worse yet, they simply do not exist. And in such cases, we have reasons to doubt whether market equilibrium would be Pareto efficient. And of course, many of you who have taken at least some courses in economics know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about externalities. Externalities occur every time when interactions between economic agents are not supported by markets. They arise when my decisions affect you, but there are no market transactions to support this influence. And the way my decisions affect you could be beneficial for you or could be harmful for you. In the first case, not only I myself benefit from my decisions, which is arguably my main rationale to take these decisions, but you too. But unless I'm a very pro-social person, a very altruistic person, I don't care about your benefiting from my decision. I'm concerned with my own gains. Or, perhaps worse yet, my decisions affect you in a negative way. You incur losses as a result of my actions. But again, this is someone else's losses. And as a result, I do not take these losses into account when I make my own decisions. Externalities about us abound. Environmental degradation is perhaps the best known kind of externalities. If several people, for example, several fishery companies use the same stock of fish, they certainly they certainly influence each other and influence each other in a negative way. And this is what is known, as you might have heard, as the tragedy of the commons. When I use my car to drive across a city amid a rush hour, then of course I create externalities because the presence of my car contributes to traffic jams. You can continue these examples on and on. One common feature of externalities is that if externalities remain uncontrolled, unregulated, uncoordinated, such externalities cause efficiency losses. Why is this the case? Think about that. If decisions are entirely private, if and at the same time, if consequences of these decisions do not affect anyone but the decision maker, then these decisions are almost by default optimal. Because the person who takes these decisions includes in his calculations, implicit or explicit, all of the gains and all of the costs. He is the only one who benefits from the gains. He is the only one who accrues the costs, and therefore he maximizes his net results. And as I said, as a result, decisions are optimal. Now, if at least a portion of the gains is felt not only by the decision maker, but by someone else, or if at least a portion of the costs, so maybe entire costs, are borne not by the decision maker, but by someone else, then social optimality, social rationality becomes separated, divorced from the private one. There is a wedge between what is good for the society and what is good for an individual, because individual in her calculations does not take in full account all of the costs and all of the benefits. Have a look at this picture on the right hand side of the slide. This is an example of an externality. Along the horizontal axis, we measure the scope of a certain activity, or I should say the scale of a certain activity, for simplicity's sake, a volume of production of a certain good. Along the vertical axis, let's measure costs and benefits. The top curve shows the top curve shows the benefits as a function of the volume. And for simplicity's sake, let's assume that these benefits are captured entirely by the decision maker, say by a producer that runs this business. Now let's talk about costs. As far as costs are concerned, here the situation is different. Let's first talk about the full cost of this activity. And these full costs are shown by this curve. Now, what would be social optimum? Social optimum would be a level of activity where the net benefits, or the difference, the vertical difference between benefits and full costs, would be maximal. And at this point it's close to zero, so apparently there is too little of this activity. At this point it's also close to zero, perhaps because there is too much of this activity. Beyond this point it's negative, so everything beyond this point would be socially counterproductive, would be socially wasteful. And if you're interested about the optimal decision, this is the one where the benefits minus the costs are at its highest level, and this is the optimal decision. So this is the optimal level, and these are the net gains of the society if this decision is made. However, suppose that the producer bears only a portion of these total costs, and the rest of this total costs is borne by someone else, by the victims of externality. Then if this externality is left unregulated, the producer will not be concerned about a portion of this cost, about the difference between these two curves. Now let's talk about the costs. First of all, let's talk about the full costs that are resulting from this activity. The curve that describes how the full costs depend on this activity is the top curve. And what is socially optimal is the activity level where the net gains, which is the difference between the benefits and the costs, is maximal. So this is social optimal. Anything less than social optimum would be a level activity level which is less than social optimal, would diminish the net social gains. If it's above what is social optimal, the net efficiency gains would be smaller as well. And beyond this point, net efficiency gains would be negative, and therefore such activity would be completely wasteful to the society. So if decisions are made in the social interest, the optimal decision will be right here. Suppose now, however, that a portion of the total cost is borne by the producer, and this is the lower curve, and a portion is borne by someone else, and this is the difference between the total cost and the portion of the cost which is borne by the producer. The balance, this difference in costs, is borne by the victims of the externality which is involved here. And as a result, the producer does not care about this gap between these two curves. The only thing that he takes into account directly, of course, provided that the externality is left unregulated, is his own costs. And that certainly affects in a very dramatic way his calculations of costs and benefits. Now, what is optimal for the producer is the activity level, the production level, which maximizes the difference between the gross benefits and his own costs. And this optimal production level is way higher than what is social optimal. Therefore, from his personal point of view, the producer behaves optimally. From the social point of view, he overproduces. And although, as a result, his personal profit considerably increases in comparison with the social optimum, the social gains decrease. They become much smaller. Here are the social gains where the decision the individual private decision by the producer is made, and you see that they're way smaller than what is optimal for the society. In fact, one can easily imagine a situation when what is optimal for the producer is actually something that entails negative net gains for the society. So that's a clear example, clear illustration of an externality. And quite obviously, in the case of externality, here we see a loss of efficiency. Private decision is not socially optimal. So it might be worthwhile to ask to what extent this difference, this gap, this separation between what is individually rational and socially optimal, to what extent it's typical, to what extent perhaps it's just, an unhappy accident. And the answer is that it's very common and very usual that a combination of social optima, if people interact with each other without using markets, is not Pareto efficient. And in fact, it's a very rare exception that a combination of social optima is Pareto efficient. And the best way to illustrate this simple point, and that's quite important to keep in mind if you want to really appreciate the role of government in modern economies, is to use a simple model, simple concept of what is an outcome of individually made rational decisions. And this is the concept of the Nash equilibrium. Suppose you have several individuals, several decision makers. Each one makes a certain decision, and people are affecting each other so that my preferences, my well-being, my utility depends on decisions taken by someone else. What is a Nash equilibrium? Everyone makes her own decision, and in a Nash equilibrium, my decision is my best response to the decisions of other agents. I cannot control decisions of other agents. They are beyond my control, but I am aware of these decisions, and I am trying to respond as best as possible to these decisions, and so does everyone else. So in a Nash equilibrium, no one has an incentive to deviate from her personal choice, given the choice of other individuals. So these decisions are individually optimal. Are they socially optimal? Are they Pareto optimal? Well, no, they aren't. And they are not optimal by Pareto as much as only possible. And let me explain why. Have a look at this illustration. Suppose that we measure the decision variable of the first individual along the horizontal axis, that is, so to say, x1. Suppose we measure the decision of the second variable individual along the vertical variable, and this is, so to say, x2. And each individual has a utility function which depends both on x1 and x2. The utility function of the first individual depends on his own choice, but it also depends on the choice of the other individual. And I will make my choice to maximize my utility, but I'm aware that my choice is also affected by the choice of another person, and vice versa. So what is a Nash equilibrium? Suppose that the second individual has made up her mind and has chosen has made her choice at this point. As a result, what is available for me as, so to say, a budget line is this horizontal line. And I maximize my preferences along this horizontal line, and the outcome of this maximization is this point. Because at this point, my indifference curve is tangent to the budget line. The same thing is true about the second individual. He reacts on my choice if I'm the first individual, and my choice is x1. So his area of choice is this vertical line. This is his budget line, and on this budget line he has to choose the best possible outcome, and of course in the best possible outcome his indifference curve has to be tangent to the budget line as well. So this is the outcome. This is a Nash equilibrium. Is it Pareto efficient? No, because if an allocation is Pareto efficient, then as you probably know, indifference curves have to be tangent to each other. Here they are not tangent, they are perpendicular. And nothing can be further away from being tangent than being perpendicular. So there is no way that this could be Pareto optimality. And in fact, this allocation between these indifference curves, as you can see, is superior for both individuals. So if there were a chance for these two individuals to move from this point to this point, both of them would have been better off as a result. Trouble is, this Pareto superior allocation cannot be supported by private decision making. It requires some coordination, and individuals are unable to achieve this coordination on their own. Well, it might not be as gloomy, because what would be a kind of natural expected reaction to this quite obviously market failure, because private decisions fail to achieve an efficient outcome, would be, okay, let's invite government. Let's invite some agency that will coordinate these individuals and will force them to make decisions that would take them away from the Nash equilibrium and put them here. And as a result, both of them will be better off, and they will be applauding such an agency and will be grateful to it for helping them to resolve this coordination problem. But there might be private alternatives. So do not rush to invite governments, because governments can cause considerable damage to the economy, as people who are suspect of government often say. Is there a chance to achieve a private resolution of this market failure? And according to Ronald Coase, there is such a possibility. Ronald Coase, of course, is a renowned American economist. Just recently passed away in a very advanced age, who made himself famous, among other things, by spelling out the so-called Coase Theorem. The amazing thing about the Coase Theorem is that this is perhaps the most popular concept of modern economics, and not just economics, but a number of adjacent social sciences. If you Google Coase Theorem, then you'll probably realize that it's the most popular hashtag in all the vocabulary of economists. And at the same time, the Coase Theorem is actually a very simple statement. It's almost trivial. And it says that rational individuals, through negotiations, will always be able, this is missed on the slide unfortunately, to make the best use of available resources, i.e. to reach Pareto optimality. Coase theory places hope on negotiations. We've reached a private solution. Let's get back to this picture. And we realize that this private solution is not the best thing that we can do. Individually, unilaterally, we cannot improve this solution. It requires a collective action. By agreement, by collective action, both of us conclude that the first agent, in fact, has to make his choice not at this point, but at this point. And the second agent has to reciprocate and make his choice not at this point, but at this point. And as a result, both of them will be better off. This is a private solution. This is a private solution because individuals reach this improvement upon themselves. No one forces them, no one helps them. It's because they're rational decision making. Again, the Coase theorem, perhaps it's powerful and so influential because it extends the idea of rationality from individuals to groups, to collectives. If not just individuals, but groups can be collective, if they can be reasonable, if they can be trustworthy, if they can communicate, negotiate, and can stick to agreements that they have reached, then you don't need a government because individuals, through these private solutions, can reach Pareto optimality. Of course, it doesn't happen all the time, and sadly, it doesn't happen most of the time. Why? Because there is one important qualification for the Coase theorem, and this one is that transaction costs, in other words, the cost involved to negotiate an agreement, to enforce this agreement, to make sure that no one shirks from the obligation that this person has taken upon himself, that these transaction costs are reasonable, they are not too high. In fact, oftentimes, the cost of negotiating, finding an agreement, and implementing, enforcing this agreement could be very high, could be, in fact, prohibitively high. And indeed, in this case, the Coase theorem offers no remedy. And indeed, transaction costs could be very high, especially when the number of involved individuals is high. Imagine a situation when there are simply 2, 3, maybe a handful of people that are involved in a potential market failure. They know each other, they trust each other, they can argue with each other, they talk to each other a little bit, and they come to an agreement. In this case, yes. The Coase theorem reigns supreme. There is no need to be involved in what happens among these people. However, imagine that there are thousands of people, there are 10,000 of people, there are millions of people that have to agree to act collectively and to reach an outcome which is provided for by the Coase theorem. It's quite obvious that this negotiation is very likely to fail. And as a result, transaction costs are very high and private solutions are simply impossible. Let's talk a little bit later about what are the failures of these collective actions, especially if the number of people is large, as is commonly the case in modern societies and modern economies.